In Part 5 of our Resident Evil recap, we covered the events of Resident Evil Outbreak, which sees 8 different survivors attempting to survive the T-virus outbreak in Raccoon City and trying to make it out alive. Here, in Part 6, we're going to move on to its sequel, Resident Evil Outbreak File Number 2, which tells more episodic, non-chronological stories across 5 different scenarios, focusing on the same 8 central characters: investigative journalist Alyssa Ashcroft, former Umbrella researcher Yoko Suzuki, specialist surgeon George Hamilton, RPD officer Kevin Ryman, private security executive Mark Wilkins, delinquent and plumber David King, waitress Cindy Lennox, and Kite Bros Railway employee Jim Chapman. Now, before we begin, this video is based on our understanding of Resident Evil Outbreak 2's story and lore, and reflects our interpretation of its events as a refresher before Resident Evil Requiem. As always, we recommend that you make your own informed call by looking into the game yourself and ensuring that it matches your expectations, standards, and personal values. Resident Evil Outbreak File Number 2 begins not long after the T-virus outbreak begins in Raccoon City, same as the first outbreak. But at this point, the city is already engulfed in chaos, to the extent that the National Guard has now moved in and has put Raccoon City under quarantine. The public message is that the city has suffered a radiation spill, a cover story drummed up by the United States government so that its own history of working with Umbrella and not only allowing, but even encouraging development of bioweapons does not come to light. That, of course, means that there's no way in or out of the city, leaving our central group of protagonists with fewer chances of escape and slimming odds of survival. In spite of that, however, Cindy Lennox leads a group of survivors that she leads to Raccoon Zoo in Outbreak File Number 2's first scenario. Why? Wild things. You see, in the early hours of the outbreak before his brutal death, which we talked about in our RE Outbreak recap, Acting RPD Chief Raymond Douglas has informed the city's population that every 4 hours, helicopters will be taking off from specific evacuation zones, carrying out groups of people one by one. Hoping that the evacuation plans are still in effect, Cindy and a group of survivors travel to Raccoon Zoo in hopes of getting to a tram that will then carry them to the evacuation zone in that part of the city. And Raccoon Zoo ends up being quite a nightmare. Well, because as you might have guessed, it is crawling with all manner of zombified and mutated animals, including an infected lion, and even a zombified elephant named Oscar that pursues them throughout the scenario. Ultimately, the group successfully makes it through the zoo and takes the tram to the evacuation site, though it all turns out to be for nothing. As it turns out, the evacuation chopper suffered an accident of its own while it was taking off, leading to a prompt crash that killed everyone who was aboard, including a significant number of survivors and even the pilot. Responding to the disaster, the National Guard takes drastic measures and cancels all further evacuation efforts. So yeah, that isn't exactly a happy ending for Outbreak File Number 2's first scenario. Underbelly. Predictably, things don't get much better in the game's second scenario, titled Underbelly, which sees another group of survivors led by Jim Chapman braving Raccoon City's subway system after fleeing from a horde of the undead. While in the station, the group realizes that they can also use a train to escape the city. This scenario sees players having to explore the subway system as they try to find a way to get one of the trains in working order. That, of course, comes with various obstacles, from zombies, surprise, surprise, to a freak train crash and more. Their biggest challenge, in fact, comes in the form of terrifying massive fleas. Yes, fleas that have been mutated by the T-virus. Ultimately, the group is able to deal with all of the obstacles that are thrown in its way and ride the train to a safe distance. But not safe enough, unfortunately. Blockages on the track force the train to stop close to the Arklay Mountains, leaving the survivors to continue their perilous journey on foot. Flashback. Now we come to Alyssa Ashcroft, who is central to the story told in Resident Evil Outbreak File Number 2's third scenario called Flashback. The episode begins with our group of survivors chancing upon an old cabin in the woods owned by a man named Albert Lester, who goes by Al. And if that name sounds familiar, it should, but we're going to get to that in a bit. Al greets the group and gives them some much-needed good news. He says he knows a way out of Raccoon City and can lead them to a neighboring town, Led by Al, the group arrives at a suspension bridge, though things quickly take a weird turn. Al mysteriously disappears. After failing to locate him, the group crosses the bridge, arriving at an abandoned hospital building. They decide to enter the building and see if there's anything in there that they can use to their advantage, though to no one's surprise, that turns out to be a bad decision. In the hospital, our heroes are forced to brave all manner of nightmares, including not only a terrifying masked man who wields an axe and pursues them throughout the hospital, and is revealed to be none other than Al, but also a gigantic, heavily mutated plant that is overgrown beyond all reason and taken over large sections of the building. The group spends much of the scenario traversing the hospital and killing pieces of the plant, while Alyssa also continues to learn crucial details about her own past. As we talked about in our recap of the original Outbreak, at the outset of her career as an investigative journalist, Alyssa was involved in the investigation of a hospital in the Arklay Mountains that was allegedly running illegal experiments on its patients, and was, of course, secretly funded by Umbrella. Alyssa was working on the story with a man named Kurt, who infiltrated the facility as a patient in order to uncover information, only to then be killed by a zombified patient named Dorothy. In the aftermath, Alyssa lost her memories of the whole ordeal, possibly thanks to Umbrella itself. But throughout this scenario of Outbreak File number 2, she pieces the whole thing back together again. The scenario culminates in a boss battle against the mutated plant's core, which, once defeated, reveals what is really at its actual core: Albert Lester's dead wife, Dorothy Lester. And yes, that's the same Dorothy. So what exactly is going on here? Well, you see, years ago, Al was the director of this very hospital where our heroes now find themselves. His wife, Dorothy, had terminal cancer, and in a desperate bid to save her life, Al entered into a less than legal and more than shady agreement with Umbrella researcher Greg Mueller, who we talked about quite a bit in our Outbreak number 1 recap. This agreement involved Umbrella being allowed to run secret and illegal experiments on patients, while in exchange, the company would perform an experimental treatment on Dorothy that may or may not deal with her cancer. You know, in spoilers, it doesn't. Dorothy was zombified and would later go on to kill Alyssa Ashcroft's investigative partner, Kurt. Later, Dorothy died herself and the hospital would shut down. While Al suffered something of a mental break, he then made a habit of returning to the abandoned hospital where, in his splintered mental state, he started caring for and nourishing a mutated plant that he believed to be his wife. He placed her body at the plant's core and would often lead people to the hospital to then feed that plant. In the here and now, though, with the plant dead and Dorothy's preserved but very dead remains in front of him, Al snaps back to reality. As the hospital begins crashing down to the ground, Al cradles Dorothy's corpse in his arms, only to be killed by falling debris. Our group of survivors, meanwhile, is able to escape the hospital in time. And that's it for the third scenario, which then brings us to the fourth one. Desperate Times. This scenario takes players to an iconic and fan-favorite Raccoon City location in the RPD building. Players work with none other than Lieutenant Marvin Branagh, who had a solid role to play in Resident Evil 2, with whose help the survivors try to find a way out of the station, which has been closed off by a horde of zombies right outside of the entrance. They succeed in opening up a secret passageway through which they send a cop named Rita, following which it's up to them to survive against the incoming onslaught of zombies long enough for Rita to arrive with help. Eventually, she does arrive in the nick of time with another cop in a van, with which the survivors climb into and make a tight escape. Unfortunately, Branagh, who has sustained injuries, decides to stay behind in the RPD, which is exactly where Leon and Claire find him in Resident Evil 2 down the road. And now we come to the final scenario of Resident Evil Outbreak number 2, titled End of the Road. The scenario sees a group of survivors led by David King heading to an Umbrella facility where some significant events are taking place. Central to the story here is Linda Baldwin, an Umbrella researcher who, after growing disillusioned with the company and its activities, has gone rogue and started taking steps to work against the company. That comes in the form of an experimental antiviral drug that could help prevent a global T-virus outbreak, which Linda has come looking for in the Umbrella facility. Waiting for her outside is a man named Captain Rodriguez, a rogue USS operative who is ready to take off in a helicopter and leave Raccoon City in his rearview mirror. Rodriguez is waiting for Linda to make it back with whatever it is that she's looking for, with him not being aware of the antiviral agent, but has also made it perfectly clear to her that he isn't going to wait very long. Interestingly enough, he's also carrying an experimental bioweapon aboard the chopper, but we're going to get to that a little bit later. Our heroes encounter Linda not long after arriving at the facility, and then take on a variety of creatures and monstrosities as they make their way forward, from hunters to a tyrant and more. Linda is eventually separated from the group and falls down sewage systems in a water treatment plant, which leads her right into the heart of Raccoon City, in front of Apple Inn, in fact, which was an important location in the first Outbreak game. This scenario of Outbreak File number 2 is heavily driven by player choice, which impacts the fate of certain characters and how the episode ends. For instance, it's up to the players to decide if they wish to head back into the city and find and rescue a heavily injured Linda. And if you do, whether or not you're able to make it back to the helicopter in time can also change things quite a bit. Ultimately, players can either successfully escape the city aboard the chopper, or you have to find your own way out while the chopper gets shot down by the army. That then, however, also releases the bioweapon that it was carrying, a horrifying experimental amalgamation of zombies, a tyrant, and who really knows what else. As you would expect, our heroes have to fight and defeat Nyx, following which they escape Raccoon City in a truck while the city is nuked behind them, which we're going to get to down the road. And that's all of Resident Evil Outbreak number 2. And given how player choice driven this game is, there's not much set in stone in terms of what becomes of its main characters, or how many of them even survive. One that we definitely know survives is Alyssa Ashcroft, who is not only the journalist looking into the Baker family's freaky activities prior to the events of Resident Evil 7, but is also going to have a role to play in the upcoming Resident Evil Requiem. Through Requiem's trailers, we know that Alyssa was murdered in Wrenwood Hotel several years before the game's events, and that her daughter, FBI technical specialist Grace Ashcroft, is one of the game's 2 central protagonists. Anyway, that is all for our recap of Resident Evil Outbreak File number 2. When we return for part 7 of our recap of the Resident Evil series, we'll be covering the events of Resident Evil 3 Remake. And that'll be about it for this one. If you guys like what we're doing at Gaming Vault, please consider subscribing to our channel, and I'll see you guys on the next video.